Okay, let's dive in. You know how economics can sometimes feel like this tangled mess of numbers and jargon and competing ideas?
Definitely. It feels dense.
It does. But really, at its heart, it's shaped by some incredibly powerful thinkers and these sort of foundational ideas that explain so much about our world, from why governments make certain choices to how we even think about prosperity and fairness.
Absolutely. And trying to figure out, who the key players are and what their core contribution really was, well, that can be daunting.
Uh-huh.
But understanding those figures, it really does give you a vital lens for looking at economic debates today.
Exactly. And that's pretty much our mission today. We're doing a deep dive into this stack of notes you've shared that explores the pioneers. They're often called the fathers, though, as the notes point out, that term is, debated.
Sure, it's subjective.
Right, the fathers of major economic ideologies. And then it tracks the most influential economists across different time periods, basically, over the last century.
So, yeah, our goal is to unpack this material, pull out the most important nuggets about these key players and their big ideas, and follow how their influence is kind of echoed through the last 100 years or so.
Think of this as your shortcut, really, to getting a handle on the giants who shaped modern economics.
Precisely.
All right, so let's start with this idea of the fathers of economic ideologies.
Mhm.
The notes are careful to mention, like you said, that pinning an entire ideology on just one person is always tricky. These are complex ideas, they evolve.
That's a really crucial distinction. It's less about like invention from scratch and more about laying down a framework that others then built upon.
Makes sense.
And the material highlights a few key ideologies here. Maybe we start with social liberalism.
Okay, social liberalism. As the sources describe it, it's about balancing individual freedoms with social justice.
Mm.
Often involves a mixed economy where the market operates alongside government intervention, welfare policies, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
So who's the figure most prominently associated with this in the notes?
Well, that would be John Rawls. His 1971 book, A Theory of Justice, is presented as just a cornerstone text.
Right, a theory of justice. And what did Rawls contribute that was so significant for this idea?
He introduced this concept of justice as fairness. His core idea really was that social and economic inequalities, they aren't inherently bad, but they're only justified if they work to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged people in society.
Hmm.
The notes do mention that while figures like, say, John Maynard Keynes influenced policies often associated with welfare states.
Like the New Deal kind of era stuff.
Yeah, that sort of thing. But Rawls provided a specific philosophical foundation for modern social liberalism, really focusing on that fairness aspect and how social goods are distributed.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, grounding the social justice piece philosophically. Now, let's pivot to an ideology often seen, well, in quite a different light. Neoliberalism. What's the core principle described here?
Neoliberalism fundamentally emphasizes free markets, minimal government intervention, deregulation, and often privatization. And according to the notes, Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek are considered its primary founders.
Two names that definitely evoke strong reactions, even today. What were their key works that sort of solidified this view?
Well, Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom from 1962 is highlighted. In it, he powerfully argued for free markets and really championed monetary policy, just managing the money supply as the main tool for economic stability, not, big government spending programs.
Right, controlling inflation via money supply.
Exactly. And then Hayek's hugely influential work, The Road to Serfdom from 1944, it famously warned against the dangers of central economic planning. She argued that relying on dispersed market knowledge, what millions of individuals know, is far more effective and, crucially, safeguards individual liberty.
And these ideas weren't just academic, were they? They had real-world influence. The notes mentioned their connection to certain groups.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, they were central figures in the Chicago School of Economics and also the Mont Pelerin Society. These groups were pivotal in promoting these free market ideas globally, and they really gained significant traction starting in the 1970s.
Got it. So minimal government, maximum market freedom. Okay, moving on, the material touches on something called democratic liberalism, noting it's maybe a less rigid term.
It is, yeah. It generally refers to combining democratic political principles with liberal economic ones. Here, the notes link it back to some foundational concepts, mentioning both a historical figure and a more contemporary one.
Interesting. Who does it point to?
Historically, John Locke. Specifically, his two treatises of government way back in 1689.
Locke, okay. Foundational stuff.
Absolutely. Locke's ideas on natural rights, individual liberty, limited government, they're seen as foundational to liberal democracy itself. And these clearly underpin economic liberalism's emphasis on things like private property and market freedom.
Or the more modern figure mentioned.
That's Amartya Sen, and his 1999 book, Development as Freedom. Sen brings this right into contemporary economics. He argues that true economic development isn't just about boosting GDP numbers.
Right.
It's fundamentally about expanding people's freedoms and capabilities, their actual ability to live lives they have reason to value. And that includes participating in democratic processes.
Oh, okay.
So the notes kind of position Locke as the historical root, with Sen adding these crucial contemporary layers connecting freedom, democracy, and development.
That's a fascinating bridge, isn't it? From 17th century philosophy right up to 21st century development economics. Okay, finally for this section, let's look at a field that has, well, fundamentally shaken up mainstream economic assumptions in recent decades. Behavioral economics.
Yeah, this area really challenges that traditional economic model, the one that assumes people are perfectly rational actors making optimal choices all the time.
Which we all know isn't quite true.
Exactly. Instead, it uses insights from psychology to understand how biases, mental shortcuts, heuristics, and emotions actually drive our economic decisions.
And who are the names highlighted as foundational here? The fathers of this field, so to speak.
Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Their collaboration was truly pioneering in establishing this field. It's worth noting, Tversky sadly passed away before he could receive it, but Kahneman's 2002 Nobel Prize explicitly recognized their joint work.
That's important context.
Yeah.
What were some of the key ideas they introduced? What really broke ground?
Well, their work back in the 1970s, especially on prospect theory, was just revolutionary. It showed that people don't always make decisions based on pure rationality or absolute outcomes. They weigh potential gains and losses differently depending on their starting point, their reference point. And this leads to predictable biases in decision making.
So it's not just random irrationality, it's predictably irrational.
Precisely. And Kahneman's later book, Thinking Fast and Slow from 2011, it just wonderfully popularized these ideas for a broader audience, explaining our two systems of thought, that fast intuitive thinking versus the slow, deliberate reasoning, and how they influence our choices, especially financial ones.
Right, a bestseller.
Definitely. And the notes point to Kahneman's Nobel as a key moment, really solidifying the field's importance and his role as a primary figure.
So wow, from the philosophical underpinnings of social liberalism with Rawls and democratic liberalism with Locke and Sen, to the free market principles of neoliberalism with Friedman and Hayek, and then the psychological realism of behavioral economics with Kahneman and Tversky, it's clear the foundations of economic thought are incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
And sometimes, in direct opposition.
Absolutely. And tracing these different roots helps us understand the different perspectives that are shaping policy and analysis today. It gives you that background.
Okay.
Now let's shift gears slightly. The material also tracks influential economists who maybe didn't found an entire ideology, but have profoundly shaped theory and policy across specific time periods, often marked by, significant research contributions or Nobel Prizes.
Right. So the notes identify key figures based on influence, publications, recognition over different eras. Let's start broad. The last century, roughly 1900 to 2000. This was a time of just massive economic upheaval and huge theoretical shifts.
It really was the century that built much of modern economics as we know it. The giants from this period, according to the source, include John Maynard Keynes, his 1936 work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. It just revolutionized macroeconomics by focusing on aggregate demand, total spending in the economy, and proposing government intervention, like spending or tax cuts, to stabilize economies, particularly during downturns like the Great Depression.
The Keynesian Revolution, yeah.
Exactly. We also see Milton Friedman again here. His work established monetarism, arguing that controlling the money supply is the primary way to manage the economy, advocating for less discretionary government action.
So a direct counterpoint to Keynes in many ways.
Very much so. And a dominant influence later in the century.
Who else made the list for this foundational century?
Paul Samuelson is highlighted. His 1948 textbook, simply titled Economics, was hugely influential. It synthesized classical, neoclassical, and Keynesian economics, basically becoming the standard introduction for generations of economics students.
Almost everyone used that textbook at some point.
Pretty much. Friedrich Hayek, as we mentioned, provided those powerful arguments for free markets and against central planning. And Joseph Schumpeter, known for capitalism, socialism, and democracy, introduced the vital concept of creative destruction.
Ah, creative destruction. Explain that quickly.
It's the idea that capitalism inherently involves this process, where new innovations, new businesses, new technologies constantly arise and destroy older, less efficient ones. It's disruptive, but it's what drives economic progress and dynamism.
Got it. A really powerful concept. You can definitely see how figures like Keynes and Friedman just set the stage for so much policy debate throughout that whole century.
Without a doubt.
Okay, let's narrow our focus now to the last 50 years, say roughly 1975 to maybe 2025. What does the material say about the dominant themes and thinkers here? What changed?
Well, this period saw economic thought grapple more explicitly with issues like rising inequality, the impacts of globalization, and finally really incorporating those behavioral insights we just talked about into the mainstream.
So more focus on real-world complexities.
I think so, yeah. And the key players from this era reflect that. Thomas Piketty is prominent, particularly for his 2013 book, Capital in the 21st Century.
Another massive bestseller.
Huge. It used extensive historical data to analyze wealth and income inequality trends over centuries. It sparked this enormous global discussion about causes, consequences, potential fixes.
Right, brought inequality right to the forefront.
Definitely. Joseph Stiglitz is also listed.
Yep.
He's known for his work on market failures, particularly information asymmetry, when one party in a transaction knows more than the other. He's been quite critical of the downsides of globalization and rising inequality, notably in books like The Price of Inequality.
Okay, so critiques of market outcomes. Does Amartya Sen appear again here? His work seems relevant.
Exactly, he does. His capability approach, highlighted in Development as Freedom, continued to be really influential. Pushing economics beyond purely monetary measures like GDP towards a focus on human potential, freedom, well-being.
A broader view of development.
Precisely. Paul Krugman is noted for his work on international trade patterns and economic geography, basically, why economic activity clumps together in certain cities or regions. That work earned him a Nobel Prize.
Trade and location.
And Robert Lucas is mentioned for introducing rational expectations theory into macroeconomic modeling. It's the idea that people use all available information rationally when forming expectations about the future, which significantly impacted how economists model policy effects. It made modeling much more complex, actually.
Right, assuming people aren't naive about policy changes. It's interesting that shift you mentioned from broad theoretical frameworks towards more focused, often data-driven analysis of specific global challenges like inequality or trade.
Yeah, that trend becomes even clearer when we zoom in further.
Let's do that. The last 20 years, say 2005 to 2025, what trends does the material identify through its list of influential figures here?
The notes really emphasize that the Nobel Prizes awarded during this time often reflect a move towards empirical applied economics, using real-world data, natural experiments, even randomized controlled trials.
Getting hands-on with the data.
Yeah.
Who stands out in this recent period?
Paul Krugman is listed again, his commentary on earlier work keeping him influential. Esther Duflo is a key figure, particularly for her pioneering work using randomized controlled trials, or RCTs.
Like medical trials, but for social policy.
Exactly. Rigorously testing what actually works in poverty alleviation, for example. It's detailed in her book Poor Economics, co-authored with Abhijit Banerjee. The notes highlight their joint 2019 Nobel Prize with Michael Kramer as really recognizing this experimental methodology in development economics.
Fascinating approach. And others who are making waves in this period.
Daron Acemoglu, co-author of Why Nations Fail, is noted for his incredibly influential work on institutional economics.
Institutions. Meaning like government quality legal systems.
Precisely. How political and economic institutions, the rules of the game, essentially determine whether a nation becomes prosperous or stays poor. His 2024 Nobel Prize with James Robinson and Simon Johnson reflects the growing importance of this field.
Okay, institutions matter. A lot.
Hugely. Richard Thaler, already linked to Kahneman and the behavioral economics founders, is also listed here. His book Nudge, co-authored with Cass Sunstein, popularized how small changes in choice architecture, how options are presented, can influence behavior for better outcomes without restricting choice.
The nudge idea, yeah. Very influential in policy circles.
Absolutely. And Angus Deaton is mentioned, known for his deep, careful analysis of consumption, poverty, and welfare, particularly explored in his book The Great Escape, which looks at long-term trends in health and wealth.
It really underscores how much economics in this era is about testing ideas with hard data and focusing on concrete problems, poverty, institutions, behavior.
It does.
Okay, finally, the very recent past, the last 10 years, say 2015 to 2025, who remains highly influential or who has emerged according to the notes?
Well, this period really reinforces those themes we just saw, behavioral insights, institutions, but it also brings a strong focus on gender economics right to the forefront.
Ah, interesting. And the names reflecting this.
Claudia Golden is a major figure here, particularly for her groundbreaking historical work on women's labor force participation, the evolution of the gender pay gap, and the complex interplay between career and family choices. It's detailed in her book, Career and Family.
And she just won the Nobel Prize.
Yes, her 2023 Nobel Prize for advancing our understanding of women's outcomes in the labor market is specifically noted as reflecting current priorities in the field, a landmark recognition.
Definitely. Who else is prominent in this last decade? We see Richard Thaler again.
Yes, his behavioral economics work continues to shape policy and research significantly.
And the other names seem to echo the recent trends we've discussed.
They do. Abhijit Banerjee and his work on poverty alleviation using experimental methods, Darren Acemoglu on institutions and prosperity, and Angus Deaton on poverty and welfare analysis are all listed again. The notes confirm their sustained influence right up to the present day.
So looking at those recent Nobels, Golden on gender, Acemoglu and his colleagues on institutions, it really signals where some of the most recognized cutting-edge work in economics is happening right now, building on those themes from the last 20, even 50 years.
Exactly. You see this clear progression from, grand theoretical frameworks in the mid-20th century to more specialized, empirically grounded investigations into specific, pressing global issues like inequality, poverty, institutional quality, and gender dynamics in the economy.
So zooming back out then, what's the big takeaway from this deep dive for you, the listener? By understanding who these key figures are, Rawls, Friedman, Hayek, Keynes, Sen, Kahneman, Piketty, Golden, Acemoglu, all of them, and the core ideas they championed, plus how the field's focus has evolved, well, you gain invaluable context.
Yeah, context for making sense of economic news, policy debates, even just how you think about the economic forces shaping your own life.
This material, it provides a structured way to navigate all that complexity. It gives you those essential landmarks without you having to, pore over every single paper or dense book yourself.
It's a useful map.
It really is. We've journeyed from the philosophical roots with people like Rawls, Friedman, Hayek, Locke, Sen, Kahneman, and Tversky.
Thinking about justice, freedom, markets, psychology,
Through the 20th century titans like Keynes, Samuelson, and Schumpeter.
building macroeconomics, synthesizing theory, understanding innovation,
And right into the contemporary landscape, shaped by figures like Piketty, Stiglitz, Krugman, Lucas, Duflo, Acemoglu, Taylor, Deaton, and Golden.
tackling inequality, market failures, trade, expectations, poverty, institutions, behavior, gender.
Touching on landmark works like A Theory of Justice, Capitalism and Freedom, The Road to Serfdom, Development is Freedom, Thinking, Fast and Slow, The General Theory, Economics, Capital in the 21st Century, The Price of Inequality, Poor Economics, Why Nations Fail, Nudge, The Great Escape in Career and Family. Phew, it's a powerful intellectual lineage.
It really is a map of how we came to understand the economy the way we do today, warts and all.
Okay, so based on everything we've covered today, drawing from this material, here's maybe a thought to leave you with. Given that clear shift in focus we've seen in the last couple of decades towards empirical analysis of specific challenges like inequality, poverty, institutions, and integrating insights from human behavior, what does this suggest are likely to be the most important questions, the biggest areas of focus for the leading economists grappling with the world's problems in the next 10 years?
Something to consider next time you read an economic headline or encounter a new study, definitely.